So my main argument today will be that in repoliticizing previously neutralized areas of social life, legitimate acts of condemnation, of denunciation, can actually play a crucial critical role. They can raise awareness and fuel important public debates over how pervasive yet invisible injustices reproduce unimpeded. I will argue that denunciations can be vehicles for communicating democratic interpellations. They can invite the passive onlooker to take a position regarding the plight of victims of misfortune, thus, of course, in the process becoming a reflective spectator who can think politically about injustices rather than misfortunes and can consider various possibilities of redress. Now, we can talk about the varieties of invisible injustices that mar constitutional democracies today. Because of a personal interest in issues related to a past of violence, I've decided to look in societies with the past of violence that redescribe injustices and violences as misfortunes in order to avoid taking responsibility for the plight of victims. And I think that such maneuvers, such discursive maneuvers, basically prevent a serious engagement with the facts about history that made abuse possible to begin with. Right, so what am I going to do today? I'm going to first build on Judith Shklar's diagnosis of depoliticized injustices within constitutional democracies. And I will argue that denunciations are one possible way of fulfilling a duty, a civic duty, to condemn suffering that we witness and that we often turn a blind eye to. Then I will take on Hannah Arendt's view on spectatorship and storytelling as a starting point, and I will argue that denunciatory theater can reveal the political nature of misfortunes and invite the public to reflect and to enter in political debates about the past. In order to give concreteness to this rather abstract theoretical part, I will then move on to two case studies. The first one is the Argentinian practice of Escraches, which are public denunciatory performances that were meant to uncover the terrible agents of the military dictatorship that ruled Argentina between 76 and 83, and that confronted, these practices managed to confront the complacent public, but also the complacent state officials in times when impunity had become normalized and neutralized. The second case study is Thomas Bernhard piece called Heldenplatz from 1988. This is an Austrian author who dedicated his career to denouncing Austria's collaboration in the Holocaust, its anti-Semitism, its enduring anti-Semitism away into the 80s, and Austria's hypocritical foundational lie that it had been Hitler's first victim. And then I will draw some conclusions. Right. Passive injustice. As I said before, I will build on Judith Shklar's notion of passive injustice, and I will start with her observation that basically political action motivated by indignation, by outrage, constitutes a marker of good citizenship within constitutional democracies. And she argues that we should believe in a duty to call injustices and not become a morally deaf and dissociated onlooker to pervasive injustices. Her definition of passive injustice is failing to prevent or report inequalities that we witness because we deem speaking too costly or too inconvenient, or because we fear social opprobrium or social pressure. And this, she thinks, leads to the depolitization and invisibilization of massive injustices. Now, she thinks that it's crucial that we make a distinction between injustice and misfortune. And she thinks injustice is the realm of the social and the controllable, and within this realm there are always appropriate occasions for outrage and condemnation, whereas misfortunes are unavoidable or natural and do not justify any form of retaliation. Naturally, this distinction can appear too stark, and it's always a matter of politics where we draw the line between misfortune and injustice. What she wants to say is that we try to reflect about misfortunes in a critical way in order to avoid allowing injustices to be conveniently portrayed as misfortunes, as nobody's fault or nobody's responsibility. Now, a few examples that she refers to: market-generated injustices, war crimes, gender-based injustices are often neutralized to references to invisible hands, catastrophe, necessity, nature, misfortune, all outside of the political. Right. So, what about the denunciation of misfortunes? What do I want to do with this notion of denouncing misfortunes? I want to argue that denouncing misfortunes can be public expressions of outrage and condemnation that contribute to the health of the political debate within constitutional democracies. And I think that denunciations can offer an alternative to the ossified, depoliticized common sense that portrays injustices as misfortunes and can stimulate political deliberations. Now, of course, we have to make a distinction between denunciations and denunciations, and not all denunciations can be considered democratically appropriate. Of course, a denial of equality to the denounced would be highly problematic. Self-righteous, unduly moralizing, disproportional or defamatory denunciations are again problematic. Those that incite to violence or hatred and those that scapegoat, again, fall outside of the spectrum of democratically appropriate forms of political action. Right, so by what virtues, right? By how can we interpret denunciations and how can we think, by virtue of what qualities can they actually perform this shift from a depoliticized language of misfortune to a politicized language of injustice? Here I draw on another theoretical idol of mine, namely Hannah Arendt and her thoughts on storytelling, on spectatorship. For her, storytelling plays two roles in her work. First is a preferred method for her as a political theorist who faces unprecedented moral and epistemic challenges in the wake of the Holocaust. And she argues that storytelling can help us think contextually without the help of principles, labels, and recipes to which we subsume particular actions in order to make sense of unprecedented historical realities. She also thinks that storytelling is capable of triggering reflective contextual judgments that can open our eyes to things that have become invisible, that have become depoliticized, and can, through linguistic shocks, reveal new meanings and new realities to the spectator. The main figure, of course, in her account of storytelling is the spectator. She talks about the historian and the artist who can sufficiently detach herself from historical events in order to make sense of their historical novelty. Now, these are not idiosyncratic judgments. There is an account of how the validity of reflective judgments is redeemed in Arendt's work, and the answer to this question is intersubjectively, through processes of enlarging one's mentality and going to visit other people's position in the social world in order to imaginatively place oneself in the shoes of the other. And it is through the power of imagination that we can see how what we perceive as a misfortune might look as an injustice if only we made the effort of this intersubjective traveling through our imagination. Now, good stories. What are good stories? Because, of course, there are many stories, but not all stories are as good. Again, she argues for artists' capacity to distance themselves, to tell a story from an unfamiliar position without falling into the temptation of absolute separateness, which is typical of most philosophers. That's what she thinks. And the value of a good story is that it can make explicit the assumptions that have, with time, become invisible to people who live within the social world. So here I quoted Lisa Dish, one of the biggest Arendt scholars, who thinks that a good story can make explicit the assumptions that determine the standards and practices of a particular regime, but are so essential to its foundation and structure that they are never stated and therefore not visible to outsiders or insiders, but only to visitors. For Arendt, Kafka's stories have this quality of actually presented as sinister or as different, as awkward, what passed as normal within the common sense of the social world. Now, what I want to argue is that the passively unjust are apathetic onlookers and not reflective spectators. They are willing prisoners of the language of misfortune who do not make the effort of going visiting, of going traveling and trying to put themselves in the shoes of the other, who are captives of this language of misfortune. And I think that good stories, and as I will show later on, it's good theater pieces and good theater performances, can invite the passive onlookers to see how the storyteller sees, namely politically. Not what the storyteller sees, but how the storyteller sees politically. To see issues previously left outside the scope of the controllable, of the social, of the political, as being actually covered by human responsibility. Right, so this was more or less a quick summary of the theoretical framework within which I want to insert my two case studies. The first one is the case study of the Argentinian dirty war that took place between 76 and 83. I'm sure everyone knows this was the dirty war that the military juntas inflicted on left-wing political movements. Between 10,000 and 30,000 leftist political activists disappeared. They were tortured, they were murdered, they were drugged through from airplanes into the Atlantic, and so on and so forth. And in the immediate years of the Argentinian transition, there were some efforts to bring justice, to have some process of reckoning with the past, but they failed. And because of a fear of another military coup that would destabilize the fragile democracy, amnesty laws and pardons were passed. Now, the consequences of this normalization of impunity was widespread apathy and actually high levels of tolerance towards the repressors, who continue to have normal, satisfying, fulfilling lives, living next door to their victims, and most importantly for this paper, complacent bystanders. The former places of detention and exterminations became places where people serviced their cars or people had lunch, right? So there was a normalization of impunity and a normalization of this language of necessity. What happened in the dirty war was an aberration of our history, of the Argentinian history. Now we move on, right? Even more interestingly, some of the torturers were invited to sensationalist TV shows, and telling the stories of torture became part of regular everyday entertainment. This, to my mind, points to a normalization of impunity and to the fact that the discourse about the necessity of the amnesties and of the pardons became widely internalized and widely endorsed unreflectively. Now, this was the general situation within the wider Argentinian population. Of course, there was political mobilization and there was legal mobilization. We all know about the madres and the abuelas of the Plaza de Mayo, who practiced political mourning as a means of protesting, and were asking to know where the bones of their children and grandchildren were interred. Then, interestingly, there were alliances with these CELS, which is the Center for Legal Studies, that actually pushed cases through the Inter-American Court for Human Rights in order to force the Argentinian state to make a step and redress the past violence. And most interestingly for me is this organization, Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice Against Oblivion and Silences, who practiced these public forms of denunciation, which are called Escraches. In Spanish, in the slang of Buenos Aires, escrachear means to reveal, to uncover, to expose. Now, these are amateur theater pieces, but they were carefully planned, they were documented, they used the repositories and the archives of the Center for Legal Studies that had actually solid legal evidence that could have passed as evidence in a court of law for who these people were. So there was solid evidence, so there was no scapegoating, right? These were highly documented criminal cases, and they used these documents in order to stage rituals of disclosure and condemnation that turned out to be a powerful weapon against the amnestied, but most importantly for this paper, against the generalized complacency and the generalized acceptance of this language of necessity. The Escraches were not the only reason why in 2005 we have a reversal of the amnesty laws. There were holes in the law, and there was, as I said, parallel legal mobilization. But the Escraches played an important role in opening up the debate within the Argentinian society about what had actually happened. Right, so their slogan was, if there's no justice, there's Escrache. And these rituals proposed and offered an alternative political language by talking about injustice and not necessity. And as I will show in some pictures later on, they also proposed an alternative political geography of Buenos Aires by naming places for what they were. Extermination camps rather than garages, right? Detention camps rather than restaurants. And this is what I would call the use of linguistic shocks. So the Escraches had two objects. They had Escraches of people, right? And when I say Escraches of people, I'm not talking only about the torturers or the genocidaires who continue to have meaningful lives, peacefully growing old in Buenos Aires, but also the neighbors of these people and the wider public that allowed these things to continue unchallenged. So during the Escraches of the people, the neighbors and the wider neighborhood was interpolated with something like, did you know that your neighbor was a torturer? How do you feel about working with him, living next to him, selling him lunch, selling him cigarettes? And the other type of Escrache is an Escrache of places, right? Most typically the Olimpo and Dorleti garages that had been used by the military for political detention, secret detention places. And part of the plays that were put up in front of the garages, you could hear something like, neighbors, listen up. Do you know that you live next to a concentration camp? While you were at home cooking veal cutlets, people were being tortured in these camps. Now, some pictures to give you an idea of what was going on. So this is a poster that offers this alternative political geography of Buenos Aires. And you have here, marked in red, all the houses where genocidaires and torturers lived in Buenos Aires after the transition. And you have, again, a map of Argentina, of Latin America, where impunity and military torturers continue to be left alone and have, as I said before, a good life. So this is part of the new geography of the city. Again, the sign over there says 50 meters from here you can find Club Atletico, which is a next clandestine detention center, right? So they would put up this, I don't know how they're called in English, like traffic indicators, traffic signs, whereby they marked places of torture, places of detention. You have here two representations of the actual plays. Part of the play was to basically make present those who had disappeared and those who had lost their identity by enacting their murder. And the other most commonly used practice was to throw red paint on the house of the torturer or of the genocidaire and say, this is where somebody, a torturer, lives, right? So it's a public denunciation. I'm going to throw a red paint on your house to mark you as what you are, right? You also have the use of pictures of the disappeared as an attempt to make them present again, right? Through the pictures and through the voices of the artists, of the actors, the disappeared became present again and had their voice heard. Right. What else? I wanted also to maybe mention that sometimes the neighbors closed their doors and called the actors hooligans, but most of the time they joined in the street and joined the protest and said, yes, it's time we started discussing about this. It's time we had a political debate about these people. The state had a concern about damage to political property, and a lot of the times policemen were deployed to protect the property of the torturers. In this case, the actors would dress up as policemen, and instead of having the usual insignia of the police, they would have an insignia whereby they said, I am here to serve impunity, and they would just stand next to the regular police in another form of symbolic artistic denunciation. So it is generally believed that this resonated strongly with the Argentinian society. Oh my God, this looks terrible. Something happened to this. Do you see that? I'll leave it like that, sorry. So it's basically understood that this has resonated within the public sphere of the Argentinian society, and that it provoked people to distance themselves from this language of necessity, misfortune, historical catastrophe, and start a debate about what can be done about this. Now, interestingly enough, this form of protest, of democratic protest, is now being employed to denounce corrupt politicians, to denounce abusive police practices, to denounce polluters, to denounce all sorts of agents within the democratic sphere that, that basically act unaccountably and that endanger the normative integrity of democracy. So it's become a common, translatable and transferable form of protest. Second case, Thomas Bernhard Heldenplatz. This must be because I did the presentation on a Mac. So Thomas Bernhard, I'm sure all of you know, was one of the most controversial playwrights of Austrian theater in the 20th century. He was somebody you can either adore or absolutely abhor. He dedicated his entire career to, as I said, denouncing Austria's participation in the Holocaust, the myth that it had been Hitler's tragic victim, always portrayed in public discourse and in history manuals as an aberration and tragic event in Austria's history, and most importantly, the enduring anti-Semitism of the Austrian society way into the 80s. Heldenplatz, which means the place of the hero, the square of the heroes, and I will show you in a second where this is in Vienna, is his last play, which symbolically premiered on the convergence of 3 anniversaries. The anniversary of the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in 1938 by Germany, the Kristallnacht, everybody knows what I'm talking about, and the 100th anniversaries of the building of the most important theater institution in Austria, the Burgtheater. Now, we cannot understand the impact of this play without contextualizing it in the events, within the events that preceded it. The Waldheim affair, Austria's president, former UN Secretary General, was disclosed, was revealed to have been a Nazi officer, and in 1986 he just won the elections after having been a UN Secretary General. Then we have an incendiary interview by the director who staged the play in the Burgtheater, Klaus Peimann, who basically denounced the institutional anti-Semitism of the artistic establishment in Austria, while at the same time affirming his belief in theater's capacity to trigger social change. Then we had another big controversy, the Hrdlička Memorial, dedicated to the fallen Jews of Europe. The socialist mayor of Vienna wanted to place it in one of the most central squares of Vienna, in Albertinaplatz. But of course, the new right, the old right, opposed it fiercely. There were big debates, a big scandal. In the end, the mayor imposed his opinion, and the memorial is placed in Albertinaplatz. Then there was the leaking of the text before the premiere, and as I will show you, the text was quite incendiary in its denunciation of this myth of absolute innocence. Then there was another scandal related to a monument in Graz. In Graz, in one of the central squares, there was a column with a statue of the Virgin Mary that during the Nazi occupation had been covered in some carton materials with the swastikas. In 1988, Hans Haacke covered the Virgin Mary again in swastikas in an artistic, symbolic, material act of denunciation about the continuation of certain attitudes after the Holocaust. And guess what? The neo-Nazi firebombed it. So it was, the monument caught fire and the Virgin Mary inside it was damaged as well. And Kronen Zeitung, one of the most conservative newspapers in Austria, published a picture of the Burgtheater, of the building of the Burgtheater in fire, saying nothing is too hot for us, so if you go ahead with this play, with this denunciation, we're going to set the theater on fire. Basically, that was the threat in the newspaper. So all these things that preceded the premiere somehow vindicated the need for the denunciation. So this is Heldenplatz, and this is a picture from the State Archive in Austria that show basically how tragic the annexation of Austria by Hitler was. These are all the masses of people who came to welcome Hitler in Vienna in 1938. And this is Heldenplatz. This is the square of heroes, right? And the theater play is entitled Heldenplatz, right? Now, this is Thomas Bernhard himself. And here I placed first the picture from the Kroner Zeitung. I said the building of the theater on fire. This is the Hans Haacke monument, firebombed by neo-Nazis. In the corner there is one detail from the Hrdlička monument that I said was finally placed in the center of Vienna. And here we have two pictures of public demonstrations that preceded the premiere. One is in support of the play, called Nest Soilers of All Countries Unite. Bernhard had earned the title Nest Soiler because he was tainting the country that allowed him to be who he was. And this one says Austria is not a Nazi land, from the right wingers who opposed the play. Right. So a few things about Heldenplatz. It must be said that within the Austrian context, it was important that denunciation took the form of art, because in Austria, art is the most efficient language, and in Austria, art is politically more important than whatever the parliament is doing. So if you are a keen observer of the Austrian politics, of Austrian press, the biggest newspapers dedicate more pages to the premiere in the theater or in the opera than they dedicate to the results of the election. So this was a very efficient way of transmitting the denunciation. It was addressed to former Nazis in position of power within the government, but especially within the cultural establishment, and to the young Austrian generation that had bought in this language of tragedy, historical tragedy and historical catastrophe. I wanted to quote one of the reviewers and one of the interpreters of Bernhard, who said that Heldenplatz basically is the expression of Bernhard's permanent rage against the moral catastrophe of Austrian history and against post-war Austria's failure to face that history, an unforgiving, unapologetic, venomously impassioned satire. Now, the plot is the story of a Jewish family, two brothers, two intellectuals, two professors, university professors, who are Austrians in all possible ways, Austrians in the most essential way in terms that, in the sense that they are culture vultures. They are high cultures addicts who were forced to escape to Britain, to Oxford and Cambridge, I think, together with their families because of World War II. But throughout their exile in Britain, they had longed with great passion for the music and for the theater and for the opera of Vienna. And they return in the 80s only to find it unchanged, only to find it as rabidly anti-Semitic as they had left it in 1938. The story is told, it takes place at the funeral of one of the two brothers who jumps to his death from the balcony of the apartment where they live, the apartment being located in Heldenplatz, in the Square of the Heroes. And it's told from the perspective of Robert Schuster, the brother of this one of the two brothers, who survives the war, survives his own brother's death, and has a very impassioned critical monologue towards the Austria that he finds in '88. The theater play ended up being a successful denunciation. It transformed the terms of the political debate. It transformed the ways in which people discussed the relationship with the past and with the Holocaust. Of course, not everybody was persuaded, but today it must be mentioned that Bernhard is one of the most exported, if not the most exported cultural product of Austria in the world, and productions of Heldenplatz that happen almost every year are never met with any form of outrage. So I'm copying here, I'm pasting from Robert Schuster's monologue. I'm going to read, "Today things are really the way they were in '38. There are more Nazis in Vienna now than in '38. Being a Jew in Austria always means being sentenced to death. People can write and say what they like. Hatred of Jews is the true and unadulterated nature of an Austrian. Before '38, the Viennese had got used to the Jews, but now, since the war, they cannot get used to the Jews, and they will never get used to the Jews. If they were honest, they'd love to gas us. Today, just as they did 50 years ago, that's what's going on inside people. I'm not mistaken. If they could, they'd kill us even today without scruple." So some pictures. This is when the monologue takes place. So it's the older brothers with his two nieces. Nieces returning from the funeral, sitting on a bench in front of the Burgtheater. So the Burgtheater's building itself is at the back of the stage, and they sit to rest in the cold winter air, where he actually vents things he had bottled inside him. Here is the last scene from the play. It's the family dinner after the funeral, and this is the widow who has since 1938 suffered psychological trauma. She keeps hearing the crowds cheering for Hitler in Heldenplatz on the occasion of his arrival, and has during the dinner an attack, and she dies during the dinner, while you hear in the background increasingly louder and louder the voices of the cheering crowds. This is the end of the play, where Bernhard with Paiman together come to take a bow, and they are met with both catcallings and booings, but a lot of applaud and a lot of enthusiasm. And this is the ton of manure that was dumped by the neo-Nazis in front of the theater on the night of the premiere. So this is clearly, you know, something that touched a raw nerve and that actually got people to show who they really were. It had a disclosive function, and it had the purpose of, the function of changing the terms of the debate. So to sum up, both Ihos and Bernhard called catastrophes by the proper name, injustices, and thus triggered some linguistic shocks that, in the context of imperfectly just democracies, led to political debates about political realities rather than about misfortunes. There are, of course, differences, because Bernhard was a consecrated writer. He was very famous. The National Theatre allowed him to put up a play every year. He spoke the language of the onlookers. He spoke the language of high art in ways that they could understand him. The main character, as I said, is a culture vulture who speaks to other culture vultures who prefer to turn their eyes away from the political reality. On the other hand, Ihos was a youth social movement that struggled to affirm themselves and struggled to open the eyes and the ears of the people in the street and of the neighbors of torturers, but they had the benefit of being the descendants of the victims themselves. So they had a certain high level of moral legitimacy. And I want to argue that both politicized the realm of necessity through performances that managed to persuade the passive onlooker to reflect on the categories through which she saw the world, and thus becoming a reflective spectator. One small point before I end. I don't think that these denunciations were moral verdicts as much as they were invitations to see things differently. That is to say, politically, and to reflect on what kind of debate citizens should have about the past, and most importantly, what kind of community they wanted to build in the future in view of what had happened in the past. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mihaela. So I'll just preview my conclusions, really, my thoughts on Mihaela's paper. The first is that I'm going to contest, really, both the definition and the value of denunciations as Mihaela has presented it. So firstly, I'm going to suggest that the expression of outrage is not a necessary and sufficient condition for the definition of a denunciation. Mihaela said at the beginning there's denunciations and there's denunciations, there's the expression of outrage, and then there's what we more typically understand as the attempt and the intention to exclude. And I want to suggest that denunciations, that is a necessary condition for understanding denunciations, that they include the intention to exclude, not merely expressions of outrage. And I also want to contest Mihaela's view that denunciations can have democratic value, have value to democracy. I want to suggest that their value to democracy is instrumental in stimulating deliberation and repoliticizing injustices that have been hidden. I want to suggest there is no role for denunciations in democracy. They have no democratic value. But they do have an important political value, which I feel been led to see by Mihaela's paper, which is they have value from the point of view of equality, from a conception of egalitarianism, particularly relational egalitarianism. So Mihaela argues that there can be an important role for political denunciations in liberal democracies, in conditions where a major injustice has occurred and where this injustice has subsequently been reconceived as an event for whom no persons or institutions should be held responsible, it can be legitimate for groups or individuals to express their view that an injustice is being hidden. This can in turn lead to a new dialogue about the injustice and can reclaim it as a matter of right and wrong and not simply as a misfortune. So I think this tells us a couple of interesting things about Mihaela's view of denunciation and about her view of liberal politics. So firstly, that denunciations are a kind of speech act, that they are also a kind of reactive attitude, like blame or resentment. So an injustice can occur when the opportunity and ability to express such a reactive attitude is illegitimately constrained. So denying someone the opportunity to hold another responsible through the attribution of agency and free will is an injustice on two counts. Firstly, it involves the initial harm or wrong, the sort of first order injustice, but then there is this second order injustice, which is preventing someone from expressing their legitimate reactive attitude that they have been wronged, and from attributing responsibility to someone or some social institution that has wronged them. So denying someone the chance to denounce an injustice is an injustice in itself. So secondly, I think it shows us that, and relatedly, that having a platform to be able to express outrage and denunciatory attitudes is part of what it is to be treated with equal respect and as a citizen, equal citizen in the democratic polity. So denunciations can be a matter of justice. So Mihaela argues that artistic expressions of denunciations, whether from street theatre to high theatre, can have a major and important instrumental role to play in stimulating debate and dialogue, and this can subsequently lead to positively addressing and then perhaps remedying the injustice. So I take it that for Mihaela it includes the liberal values of equality and freedom, such that the expressions of denunciation are constrained by our duties to treat others as equals. So I find these arguments striking, I find them original and compelling, but also find them unsettling. And I find that they actually lead us in a different direction from the one that Mihaela arrives at in her paper, a much more radical destination I think we arrive at if we take these thoughts seriously. So I want to suggest that denunciation ultimately has no instrumental or intrinsic value from the point of view of democracy, but I'm convinced that it has a powerful role as part of a relational egalitarian politics. Denunciations are crucial in disputes about justice. They're intrinsically condemnatory and aim at exclusion. Importantly, they endorse the relational egalitarian view that power, voice, and standing are crucial matters of justice, and that anyone or any institution denying or repressing such injustices is liable to condemnation, denunciation, and exclusion. So why do I claim that denunciations are not of instrumental value? So Mihaela argues that denunciatory practices such as street or high theatre can prompt people to look again at political settlements such as in post-dictatorship Argentina or post-World War II Austria, where injustices have been hidden and recharacterized as misfortunes, for whom no one can be held responsible. So these denunciations can then lead to deliberation and debate which can reclaim or repoliticize the language of politics and reassert responsibility. So this is the instrumental case for denunciation, the instrumental value of denunciations in a democratic politics. But if we look more closely, it seems to me that the denunciatory acts rely on background conditions of deliberation and a shared commitment to liberal values underlying those deliberative commitments. So without these, there is no point to denunciations. The instrumental role of denunciations are not as a tool to promote denunciation. I'm suggesting that they are not a tool to promote deliberation. They're a move within deliberation. So the thought is that what we have in these practices that Mihaela has presented to us is not denunciation proper, but is, in fact, the theatre or the spectacle, the portrayal of denunciation as a way of representing and refracting our deliberation and our outrage through an aesthetic mode. but they're not denunciations proper. It is deliberation that is the tool that is of value in these debates, in these disputes. We're using the grammar, if you like, of a denunciation, the vocabulary of a denunciation, but we are not intending to denounce. That is, to exclude. But we are expressing our outrage through this representation, if you like, of denunciation. So someone, Mihaela, might respond by saying, well, that is the point, that these denunciations are spectacles and they are representations, that this can have instrumental value on democratic deliberation. But I want to suggest that there are 3 reasons why we should not regard denunciations as having this role within democracy and have this democratic value. So the first is that these forms of denunciations have no procedural value. So if you take a procedural justification or account of democracy, there is no sense in which these denunciations represent the equal standing of citizens involved in some way. There's no procedural entitlement to the right of reply. So any of those procedural values that we feel are characterized by democracy are not found in democracy. So it does not represent, cannot be justified in terms of a procedural account of democracy. Epistemically, these denunciations are not aiming at truth. They're aiming at the expression of the reactive attitude of outrage. These are plays. These are not factual accounts of what happened. They're not intended to be factual accounts of what happened. If you're interested in the epistemic justification of democracy, and you're interested in giving opportunity to express outrage and condemnation, it seems to me something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be more appropriate. And also it seems to me that these have limited deliberative quality. Denunciations are univocal, they're expressive. They do not invite deliberation, they do not invite reply and reasoning and all those moves we take it as important as in deliberation. I don't think I would find it very easy to deliberate with someone who is denouncing me. So what is their value then, if it's not instrumental and if it's not democratic? Well, it seems to me they're of intrinsic value from the point of view of relational equality. So to be able to denounce an injustice requires an ability to express one's own views, to be heard, to have standing, and to be treated with respect, of being entitled to express one's reactive attitude of denunciation. To be denied this is to be done an injustice, a relational injustice, to be denied equal power, presence, and dignity. If any individual or social institution prevents this, they're acting unjustly in a particularly fundamental and heinous way. This deserves denouncing. This deserves exclusion. They are not legitimate reasons to be included in our deliberation. At least normatively, they should be excluded. They should be disowned and unmasked for their hierarchical and disrespectful nature. So it seems to me that if we lose sight of the exclusionary dimension of denunciation, we remove a particularly potent normative claim that we're entitled to make to exclude certain reasons that impose a certain power relationship, a certain hierarchical relationship, which is itself inegalitarian and illegitimate. So Mihaela's paper helps me see, and I hope others too, that if you are an egalitarian, if you do care about respect and dignity and community, characterized by integration and plurality of voices, then injustices that attempt to mark and conceal must be confronted and denounced. So to be able to denounce injustice is to be able to express one's dignity and to take a stand on the public platform and to be heard proclaiming outrage and condemnation. So even if this has no instrumental epistemic, procedural or deliberative benefit, it is valuable because it is a legitimate expression of our entitlement to have a reactive attitude and to be able to express that as an equal member of our society. So I really enjoyed the paper. I'm really grateful for Mihaela for her creativity, I think her insight and courage in seeking to redeem denunciation for democratic politics. But plead we should embrace its intrinsic value to equality and not restrict it to theatres of denunciation which seem of limited use and value to me.
Thank you. Thank you. This is wonderful. Should I respond? Yes. So I initially had the impression that you were going to just say, chuck it all out, because denunciation is problematic, because in your understanding or definition of it, it presupposes the exclusion of the denounced in a way that you found problematic. But then towards the end, I think that it actually we are more in agreement than it might appear prima facie. So let me try to go back to what you were saying. I don't think that I want to enter in a debate about definitions. You know, the purpose of this paper was not to provide a normatively sound, rigorous account of what denunciation is, but to see the potential of art in its denunciatory form as triggering debates where there was no debate before. So because of this particular aim, I think that there is instrumental value. So the way I thought about it was instrumentally, and I think there is procedural value, I think there is epistemic value, and I think there is something to be said about them not being univocal, and I'm going to try to address this one by one. You were saying that procedurally denunciation do not observe procedural standing. I think they do because they give voice, and they give voice to those that had been excluded as equal citizens from discussions about the past. To the extent that the Argentinian and the Austrian state talk about misfortunes as catastrophes, they obscure the fact that there were real winners and beneficiaries of violence and real losers, and relegates the losers to the realm of at best second class citizens. And I think that, as I showed in the pictures, Robert Schuster, like the main character in Heldenplatz, and then all these pictures of the disappeared are basically used artistically in order to give voice and to defend the equal standing of those who had been silenced in contemporary debates, right? Secondly, this is not about truth. I think these denunciations are epistemic in a different sense, not in telling you what to think, but in telling you how to think, in changing the terms of the political debate rather than in stipulating this is the thing to do about the past, right? What they're trying to say is how we can start to think about what we want to do with our future, given that our past was not a catastrophe, was not a tragedy, was not something that was completely outside of our control, but was something that we bear at least partial responsibility for. So the epistemic gain is in terms of the mode of reflection rather than the object of reflection. And your third concern, which I think is the strongest and the most important, the fact that denunciations are historically and have been historically univocal, stipulative, right? So this is a verdict that I'm giving you, right? I want to try to argue that these denunciations that are basically addressed to the wide public sphere and that target the endorsement of a neutralized language are not univocal, as I said before, changing the terms in which we talk about something. Rather than saying this is the truth, this is the absolute truth, is they are saying how can we have a discussion about this, right? Arendt has a very interesting relationship to the notion of truth because she is very skeptical of stipulative truths in politics, and I think this is the same concern that you have. But she makes a distinction between these things that we affirm as politically true and that stop the deliberation and factual truth. I think that to a certain extent, both the Escraches and the Bernhard play brought to the fore some factual truth, right? So look at these pictures of Hitler in Heldenplatz. This is a factual truth, right? It's not about stipulating a political truth. I think the denunciations want to say, well, this is the factual truth. What do we do next? Given this is what happened, yeah, how can we reimagine our future as a political community? How can we redress exclusions? What form should the institutional mechanisms of redress take if we are to live up to our normative commitments? So this is why I thought initially that it is I'm providing an instrumental defense of denunciations as triggers of deliberation. So I think that you raised a very important point here when you said that a denunciation rely on a shared commitment to democracy. Absolutely. I'm talking about democratic denunciation. I think in the title of the paper, maybe in this version it's not there, but it's democratic denunciation. And I think that it's not just a move within deliberation, because there was no liberation before, right? So there was no meaningful political deliberation before the trigger. So I think it's a matter of nuance, whether it's a trigger or it's a move within or the start of a deliberation, but I assumed it as a form of contribution, a contributing mode, a mode of contributing to to the deliberation. What else was there? And the commitment to democracy, I want to specify, this is very important. The commitment to democracy was something very important both on the side of the denunciators, and on the side of the state. At no point did the Argentinian state prevent the Escrache. At no point was physical force applied to the actors. At no point was Bernhard prevented from staging his plays or for writing his plays in Austria. The commitment to the freedom of speech and to the reproduction of democracy as a regime that allows, freedom of speech to contribute to deliberation was very strong on both sides of the conflict. Let's call it conflict. So yeah, I don't know. Did I answer your?
Yep.
Right.
Okay, very good. Thank you.